The small music room at the community college was almost empty when she walked in that morning. A cold breeze followed her through the door as she quietly made her way to the last seat near the window. Nobody noticed her arrival. A few students were busy talking loudly about an upcoming performance, while others laughed over videos playing on their phones. She placed her old notebook carefully on the desk and sat down without saying a word. The notebook looked worn out from years of use. The corners were bent, several pages were loose, and the cover had faded from dark blue to a dull gray. Most people would have thrown it away long ago, but to her it was the most valuable thing she owned. Inside were pages filled with music notes, small ideas, unfinished songs, and little reminders written in pencil. She opened it slowly while the music instructor prepared the class piano at the front of the room. "Today," the instructor announced, "everyone will play something original next week. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I want effort." Excited voices filled the room immediately. One student proudly said he had already started composing something professional. Another talked about hiring a private coach for help. A girl near the front spoke about performing at family parties since childhood. Meanwhile, she quietly lowered her eyes back to her notebook. Nobody asked what she planned to play. Nobody expected much from her anyway. She had been attending the class for almost a year, yet most students barely remembered her name. She never joined group conversations. She never showed off her skills. Whenever someone played loudly or confidently, she simply listened in silence. Some people assumed she lacked talent. Others believed she was too shy to perform properly. But the truth was very different. Every evening after classes ended, she walked across town to a small old church near the edge of the city. The church wasn't famous or beautiful. Its paint was peeling. Several lights barely worked, and during winter the inside felt colder than the streets outside. But near the back wall stood an old upright piano. A few keys stuck sometimes, and the sound often felt uneven, yet she loved that piano more than anything else. The pastor allowed her to practice there after noticing her sitting outside one evening months earlier. Since then, she visited almost every day. No audience, no applause, just her and the piano. That same evening after college, she arrived at the church carrying her notebook tightly against her chest. The sky had already started turning dark, and soft rain tapped against the windows as she stepped inside. The pastor smiled warmly from across the room. "You're early today," he said gently. She smiled back politely. "Class ended sooner." He nodded before returning to his work near the front rows. She walked toward the piano and sat down slowly. For a few seconds, her fingers rested quietly above the keys. Then she started playing. The melody was soft at first. Simple notes filled the empty church one by one, almost like someone speaking quietly after years of silence. There was nothing flashy about her music. No dramatic movements. No attempt to impress anyone. But there was feeling in every note. The kind of feeling that could not be taught in expensive classes. She closed her eyes while playing, completely lost inside the music. The outside world disappeared during moments like these. The stress of bills, loneliness, tiredness, and quiet disappointments all faded away whenever her fingers touched the piano. Music was the only place where she truly felt understood. After nearly an hour, she stopped suddenly and sighed softly. Something still felt incomplete. She grabbed her notebook and quickly wrote a few new notes across the page. Tiny pencil marks filled the margins beside older melodies she had written months ago. Most people had no idea she spent years creating her own music. Not because anyone asked her to, but because writing music became the only way she knew how to express herself. As she continued writing, the church janitor slowly passed nearby carrying cleaning supplies. He often worked quietly during her practice sessions and rarely interrupted. But that night he paused for a moment. "You wrote that yourself?" he asked. She looked slightly nervous before nodding. "I try sometimes." The old man smiled faintly. "Doesn't sound like trying to me." She didn't know how to answer, so she simply looked back down at the notebook. Compliments always made her uncomfortable. A few minutes later, she began practicing again. Outside the rain grew heavier. Inside the church, Her music continued flowing through the empty halls. Back at college the next morning, students crowded around the main notice board near the entrance. Curious voices filled the hallway as everyone pushed closer to read a newly posted flyer. Regional Piano Showcase. Participants wanted. Local judges. Live audience. Scholarship opportunities. Excitement spread instantly. This could actually help careers, one student said. Another laughed nervously. I'm definitely signing up. She stood quietly near the back, reading the flyer from a distance. Her heart beat slightly faster. She had never performed publicly before. Not once. The idea alone terrified her. Still, something about the flyer stayed in her mind throughout the entire day. During lunch break, she sat alone outside beneath a tree while flipping through her notebook again. Wind gently moved the loose pages as she stared at one unfinished melody near the center. A nearby group of classmates noticed her notebook. "You composing something?" one boy asked jokingly. Another laughed. "Maybe she's secretly preparing for the showcase." The group chuckled lightly. She forced a small smile, pretending the comments didn't bother her. But deep down they did. Not because they were cruel, but because they reminded her how invisible she felt around everyone. Before leaving campus later that day, she quietly walked back toward the notice board. Most students had already written their names on the sign-up sheet. She stood there for almost 2 full minutes. Then slowly, with trembling hands, she picked up the pen and added her name at the bottom. The moment she stepped away, doubt hit her immediately. What was she thinking? These people had years of professional training. Some owned expensive instruments at home. Others performed regularly in front of crowds. She practiced on an old church piano with broken keys. Who was she trying to compete with? That evening, her playing felt different. Uncertain. Distracted. She kept making mistakes while practicing simple sections she normally played perfectly. Frustrated, she stopped and buried her face in her hands. Maybe everyone else was right. Maybe she wasn't good enough. Maybe her music only sounded meaningful because nobody else ever heard it. The church remained silent around her. For several long moments, she didn't touch the piano at all. Then something caught her attention. Near the front rows, the pastor sat quietly listening. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't realize anyone was here." He smiled gently. "Why did you stop?" She hesitated before answering. "I don't think I belong in that competition." The pastor looked at her carefully for a moment. "Do you know why people connect with music?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "Because real music carries truth," he said. "And truth reaches people faster than perfection." She stayed silent. The pastor stood up slowly and continued. "Some play to impress. Others play because they have something real inside them." After saying that, he quietly walked away. His words stayed in her mind long after he disappeared. She turned back toward the piano and placed her fingers on the keys once more. This time, she didn't think about judges, or competitions, or talented students at college. She simply played. And little by little, the fear inside her began turning into determination. For the next several days, her routine became even harder. College during the day, part-time work in the evening, practice at night, sleep for only a few hours, then repeat everything again. Some nights her fingers hurt badly enough that she struggled carrying books home. Other nights exhaustion nearly made her fall asleep at the piano. Still, she kept going. Because deep inside, a small part of her finally started believing something she had never believed before. Maybe her music deserved to be heard too. And although nobody around her could see it yet, everything in her life was slowly leading toward one moment that would soon change everything forever. She could still remember the very first time music truly touched her heart. She was only 9 years old back then, small enough that her feet barely reached the floor while sitting on the old city bus beside her mother. Outside, snow slowly covered the streets, and cold air slipped through the windows every time the doors opened at a stop. Her mother looked exhausted after another long shift at the diner. Dark circles rested under her eyes, and her hands looked rough from years of hard work. But despite being tired, she still smiled whenever she looked at her daughter. Hungry? Her mother asked softly while searching through her purse. She shook her head. I'm okay. The truth was they both knew there wasn't much money left that week anyway. The bus finally stopped near a small hotel downtown where her mother had picked up extra cleaning work for the evening. Since there was nobody to watch her at home, she came along quietly carrying a small book in her lap. The hotel lobby looked warm and beautiful compared to their tiny apartment. Soft lights glowed from the ceiling. People talked quietly near the fireplace, and the smell of coffee filled the air. But none of that caught her attention. Near the center of the room sat an elderly man playing a grand piano. The moment she heard the music, she froze completely. Her mother noticed immediately. You like it? She whispered. She nodded slowly without taking her eyes off the piano. The old man's fingers moved gently across the keys, creating melodies that somehow felt peaceful and emotional at the same time. She didn't understand music back then. She couldn't read notes or explain why the sound touched her so deeply. She only knew it made her feel something she had never felt before. For almost an hour she stood there quietly listening while guests came and went around the lobby. Even after her mother finished cleaning duties, she still didn't want to leave. On the ride home, she sat silently staring out the window before finally speaking. Do you think I could learn piano someday? Her mother looked at her carefully. There was sadness behind her smile because she already knew how expensive lessons and instruments were. Some weeks they struggled just to pay rent and buy groceries. Still, her mother gently held her hand. One day, she said softly, somehow we'll find a way. Those words stayed inside her heart for years. From that moment on, every time she passed a piano anywhere, schools, stores, hotels, churches, she stopped to listen. Music slowly became her escape from everything difficult around her. At home, life never became easier. The apartment building was old and noisy. Pipes leaked constantly. Neighbors argued through thin walls at night, and winter mornings felt freezing without proper heat. Her mother worked endless hours trying to keep their small life together. Yet no matter how tired she became, her mother always encouraged her daughter's dream. Sometimes they watched free music videos together on an old secondhand laptop that barely worked properly. Other times her mother would tap rhythms on the kitchen table while laughing at how serious her daughter became trying to copy them. You already act like a real musician, she once joked. Those small moments became her happiest memories. Years passed, and her love for music only grew stronger. But reality remained difficult. Piano lessons were still impossible to afford. Most children around her joined sports teams, dance groups, or music classes after school. Meanwhile, she spent afternoons helping her mother with chores or studying quietly at home. Still, she never gave up completely. At 13, she found a broken keyboard sitting near a trash bin outside another apartment building. Several keys didn't work, and part of the plastic was cracked badly, but she dragged it home anyway. Her mother laughed in surprise when she saw it. You carried that all the way here by yourself? It still works a little, she said hopefully. That old keyboard became her greatest treasure. Every evening she sat on the floor practicing tiny melodies she learned from free online videos. Since headphones were broken too, she kept the volume low so neighbors wouldn't complain. First, everything sounded terrible. Her timing was wrong. Her hands moved awkwardly. Simple songs took hours to learn. But she kept practicing. Again and again, day after day. Whenever frustration made her want to quit, her mother always encouraged her. Slow progress is still progress, she would remind her gently. Those words helped more than she realized. By 15, she could finally play full songs without stopping constantly. She began writing little melodies of her own inside a notebook she carried everywhere. Most people around her never knew. Music became something deeply personal, a quiet world that belonged only to her. Then life suddenly changed. One evening her mother returned home looking unusually tired. At first she claimed it was only stress from work, but over time her health became worse. Some mornings she struggled getting out of bed. Other days she forced herself through long shifts despite clearly being exhausted. Still, she tried hiding her pain. One night while practicing softly on the old keyboard, She noticed her mother sitting nearby listening quietly. "You'll play on a real piano someday," her mother said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe." "No," her mother replied gently. "Not maybe. You will." That conversation stayed in her memory forever. A few months later, her mother's condition became serious enough for hospital visits. Bills piled up quickly. Fear filled their small apartment more heavily than silence ever had before. She tried staying strong, but deep down she felt terrified. The woman who supported every dream, every struggle, every painful moment in her life suddenly looked fragile. One rainy afternoon, while sitting beside the hospital bed, she quietly asked, "What if I'm not good enough?" Her mother looked at her with tired but warm eyes. "Music isn't about being better than everyone," she said softly. "It's about making people feel something real." Those became some of the last meaningful words she ever heard from her. Not long afterward, her mother passed away peacefully. The loss shattered her world completely. For weeks she barely spoke to anyone. The apartment felt unbearably empty without her mother's voice, laughter, or late-night encouragement. Even simple things became painful reminders. An unfinished coffee cup, folded work uniforms, old grocery notes on the refrigerator. Worst of all was the silence. The silence hurt more than anything. For the first time in years, she stopped playing music entirely. The broken keyboard sat untouched in the corner collecting dust. Nothing felt meaningful anymore. School became difficult. Friends slowly stopped calling. Days blended together in a blur of sadness and exhaustion. Then one evening, while cleaning the apartment alone, she found her old notebook hidden beneath a pile of clothes. Inside were years of melodies, tiny dreams written across hundreds of pages. As she flipped through them, a folded piece of paper slipped out. It was a short note written in her mother's handwriting. "Never stop playing." That single sentence broke something inside her. She cried harder that night than she ever had before. But the next morning, she walked over to the old keyboard and pressed a key for the first time in weeks. The sound was imperfect, weak, broken, yet somehow comforting. Little by little, she began playing again. Not because the pain disappeared, but because music became the only place where she still felt close to her mother. Over time, practicing turned into healing. Every note carried emotion she could not explain with words. Loneliness, love, memories, hope. She poured all of it into the piano. Years later, when she finally joined community college music classes, nobody understood how much music truly meant to her. To others, it was simply talent or hobby. To her, it was survival. That was why she practiced longer than anyone else. Why she filled notebook after notebook with melodies. Why even criticism never fully stopped her. Because every time she sat at a piano, she remembered a promise made long ago on a freezing bus ride home. One day, somehow we'll find a way. And no matter how difficult life became, she refused to let that promise disappear. The closer the competition day came, the heavier her thoughts became. At college, the regional piano showcase was suddenly the main topic everywhere. Students talked about it in hallways during lunch breaks even before classes started. Some discussed what songs they would perform. Others worried about judges and stage fright. Meanwhile, she stayed quiet as always. Only now there was one difference. Her name was officially on the participant list. Every time she passed the notice board and saw it written there, her stomach tightened with fear. Part of her still wanted to remove it before anyone noticed. One afternoon after class, several students gathered near the practice rooms comparing performances. A tall student confidently played a difficult classical piece while others clapped and praised him loudly. "Definitely competition material," someone said. Another student noticed her standing nearby. "What are you performing?" he asked casually. She hesitated. "I'm still deciding." "You wrote your own piece, right?" Another girl asked with a faint smile that didn't feel entirely kind. Before she could answer, one boy laughed softly. "Honestly, original songs are risky unless you're really good." A few people nodded in agreement. She forced a small polite smile and quietly walked away. The comments stayed in her mind long after she left. That evening at the church, her hands felt stiff while practicing. Simple sections suddenly sounded wrong. Her timing slipped repeatedly, and frustration slowly built inside her. She stopped playing and stared down at the keys. Maybe everyone else was right. Maybe she was aiming too high. The students around her had years of formal training. Some came from families filled with musicians. Others performed confidently in public since childhood. She learned from broken keyboards, free videos, and lonely nights inside an old church. How could she possibly belong on the same stage? The thought haunted her constantly. Still, despite all the doubt, she kept showing up every evening. Practice became less about confidence and more about refusing to quit. A few days later, the music instructor announced that all participants would perform short previews in class before the competition. The room instantly filled with nervous laughter. Her heart nearly stopped. One by one, students performed small sections of their chosen pieces. Some made mistakes but recovered smoothly. Others received applause and encouragement from classmates. Then her name was called. For a moment, she couldn't move. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Slowly, she stood up and walked toward the piano at the front. The silence felt unbearable. She sat down carefully, trying to ignore the nervous shaking in her hands. Her breathing became uneven as she placed her fingers above the keys. Then she started playing. The melody began softly, almost too quietly for the room. Some students looked distracted at first. One person checked their phone while another whispered to a friend nearby. But she kept playing. Little by little, the room grew calmer. The notes carried sadness, warmth, and something deeply personal hidden beneath the melody. It wasn't perfect technically. A few transitions sounded rough. Yet there was honesty in the music that slowly pulled attention toward her. Halfway through the preview, the classroom became completely silent. Even the students who rarely listened closely now looked toward the piano. When she finished, nobody spoke immediately. Then the instructor quietly said, "That felt real." She looked down quickly, unsure how to react. A few students clapped politely while others remained strangely thoughtful. As she returned to her seat, she noticed something different in the room. People were looking at her differently now. Not like the invisible quiet girl sitting in the back anymore. For the first time, they seemed curious. Later that evening, while leaving campus, one classmate hurried to catch up with her outside. "That song," the girl said carefully. "Did you really write it yourself?" She nodded nervously. "It sounded emotional," the girl admitted. "In a good way." Before she could respond, the girl smiled awkwardly and walked away. The conversation was short, but it stayed in her mind all night. Maybe her music truly could reach people. Still, fear didn't disappear. As competition day approached, pressure only grew stronger. At work, she struggled concentrating during shifts. While taking orders and cleaning tables, her mind constantly replayed melodies and imagined possible mistakes. What if she froze on stage? What if her hands started shaking? What if people laughed? The fear became so overwhelming that one night she almost removed herself from the competition entirely. After finishing work late, she walked slowly toward the church under freezing wind. The streets were nearly empty, and dark clouds covered the sky above the city. By the time she reached the church, exhaustion covered her face completely. She sat at the piano without even opening her notebook. For several minutes, she simply stared at the keys. Then quietly, she whispered to herself, "I can't do this." The words felt painfully real. Tears slowly filled her eyes as frustration, pressure, loneliness, and fear crashed together all at once. She thought about her mother, about all the nights spent practicing alone, about years of hoping for a chance to be heard. And suddenly, none of it felt enough. Her fingers touched the keys gently. Without planning to, she began playing the melody her mother loved most. The familiar notes echoed softly through the empty church. Unlike her competition piece, this melody carried pure memory inside it. Every note reminded her of late-night smiles, tired but loving eyes, and quiet encouragement during difficult years. As she played, emotion slowly replaced fear. Her breathing calmed. The music flowed naturally again. Near the back of the church, the janitor quietly paused his cleaning and listened. He had heard her practice many times before, but tonight felt different. When she finished playing, silence filled the room for a few seconds. Then the old man spoke softly. "Why do you look so afraid?" She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed someone noticed. "I'm not ready for this competition," she admitted quietly. The janitor leaned against a nearby bench. "You know," he said, "I've heard many people play piano in my life." She stayed silent. "Some were technically perfect," he continued. "Fast hands, expensive training, fancy performances." He looked toward the piano. "But very few made people feel something." His words settled heavily in the quiet room. "You do," he added simply. She lowered her eyes. "I still might fail." The old man smiled gently. "Maybe," he said honestly, "but hiding your gift from people would be the bigger failure." For a long moment she didn't speak. Then slowly, something inside her shifted. Not confidence exactly, but acceptance. Maybe fear would always exist. Maybe she would still shake on stage. Maybe things could still go wrong. But she realized something important that night. She wasn't playing music to compete with others. She was playing because it carried pieces of her life inside it. And those pieces deserved to be heard. The following morning, she woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight slipped softly through the apartment window while she sat at the kitchen table drinking tea and reviewing her notebook one last time. Unlike previous days, her thoughts felt quieter. The fear remained, but it no longer controlled her completely. When she arrived at college later that day, excitement filled the hallways. Contestants hurried around carrying sheet music and garment bags, while instructors organized final schedules. A large poster near the entrance displayed the showcase information proudly. "Regional Piano Showcase tonight, Main Auditorium." She stared at the words for several seconds. Tonight, it was finally happening. Several classmates gathered nearby discussing the audience size and local judges attending the event. One student nervously joked about forgetting notes on stage. Another complained about pressure from family expectations. For once, she realized everyone was afraid in some way. Even the confident students. That thought strangely comforted her. As evening approached, participants slowly gathered backstage inside the auditorium. Bright stage lights shined beyond the curtains while audience members filled seats one row at a time. The sound of conversations echoed through the building. Her hands felt cold. She sat quietly in a corner holding her notebook tightly, while other performers stretched fingers, reviewed music sheets, or spoke with supportive family members nearby. She was alone, but somehow, she no longer felt invisible. A stage assistant walked through the backstage area calling participant names and performance order. When her name was announced, her heartbeat quickened instantly. Only a few performers remained before her turn. From behind the curtain, she could hear applause after each performance. Then suddenly silence. A stage worker looked toward her. "You're next." Her breath caught for a moment. She closed her notebook slowly and stood up. And as she walked toward the stage lights waiting beyond the curtain, she had no idea that the next few minutes were about to change her entire life forever. The bright stage lights felt almost blinding as she stepped out from behind the curtain. For a second, she could barely see the audience sitting beyond the glow. Rows of people filled the auditorium from front to back. Some leaned forward with interest while others quietly reviewed programs in their hands. The sound of applause from the previous performer slowly faded away. Then the room became still. She walked carefully toward the piano placed at the center of the stage. Every step felt heavier than normal. Her heartbeat echoed loudly inside her chest, and her hands felt colder with every passing second. Somewhere in the audience, a person coughed softly. Another shifted in their seat. Everything suddenly sounded too loud. She reached the piano bench and sat down slowly. For a brief moment, she stared at the black and white keys in front of her without moving. Fear returned instantly. What if she forgot everything? What if her hands froze? What if people realized she didn't belong there? Her breathing became uneven again. From backstage, another contestant quietly watched her with crossed arms. Several judges sat near the front row with papers resting on their laps, ready to write notes during the performance. One judge looked tired already after hours of listening to contestants. Another barely glanced up from the table. The pressure nearly crushed her. Then something small caught her attention. Near the far side of the audience, she noticed the old church pastor sitting quietly in the crowd. Beside him sat the janitor. Neither smiled or waved. They simply looked at her with calm support. Suddenly, she remembered all the nights spent inside that cold church practicing alone. Every mistake. Every exhausted evening after work. Every time she almost quit but didn't. Those memories slowly pushed away the fear. She closed her eyes for one deep breath, then finally placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes entered the auditorium softly. So softly that some people near the back leaned forward slightly to hear better. It wasn't a dramatic beginning. There were no fast movements or loud openings meant to impress people instantly. Just simple notes. Gentle, careful, honest. A few audience members still looked distracted at first. One man near the aisle quietly checked his phone, while another judge adjusted papers on the table. But she kept playing. The melody slowly grew stronger. Each note carried emotion hidden beneath the surface, almost like a conversation without words. Her fingers moved naturally now, no longer controlled by fear but by memory and feeling. The piano no longer felt like an instrument, felt like a voice. Little by little, the atmosphere inside the auditorium changed. The judge who looked tired earlier slowly lifted his eyes from the papers. The woman checking her phone lowered it completely. Whispers disappeared. The room grew quieter with every passing second. She didn't notice any of this at first. She had become completely lost inside the music. As the melody continued, memories filled her mind. The freezing bus rides with her mother. The broken keyboard rescued from the trash. Late nights practicing while neighbors yelled through apartment walls. Hospital visits. Lonely evenings. The small note hidden inside her notebook never stopped playing. Without realizing it, emotion slowly entered her performance more deeply than ever before. Her hands trembled slightly during one section, but instead of ruining the music, it somehow made it feel even more human. Real. The audience could feel it. Near the middle rows, a woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes while listening. An older man sitting beside her stared at the stage without blinking. Even contestants waiting backstage stopped talking and moved closer to the curtain to watch. Nobody expected this from the quiet girl nobody noticed before, especially not the students who once laughed at the idea of her competing. One classmate stood completely still near the side entrance, unable to look away from the stage. "This is her?" he whispered softly to another contestant. The other student nodded slowly without speaking. Meanwhile, she continued playing as if the entire world around her had disappeared. The difficult sections no longer scared her. Her fingers moved with confidence she didn't even know she possessed. Years of silent practice suddenly came alive in front of everyone. The melody rose higher, becoming more emotional and powerful. Every note felt meaningful. Not perfect, but meaningful. And somehow that mattered more. Near the front row, one of the judges stopped writing entirely. He simply listened. Another judge slowly leaned back in her chair, clearly surprised. The music no longer sounded like a student performance. Sounded like a story, a real one, and everyone inside the auditorium could feel it. As the performance approached its final section, silence completely filled the room. Nobody moved anymore. Nobody whispered. Even the air itself felt still. Her final melody began softly again, almost like the music was gently saying goodbye. The last few notes carried sadness, hope, love, and years of struggle all at once. Then finally, one final note echoed across the auditorium and ended. Complete silence followed. For one terrifying second, she thought maybe people hated it. Her heart dropped instantly. She slowly looked up from the piano for the first time since beginning the performance. The audience sat frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then suddenly, applause exploded across the room. Loud, immediate, real. People rose from their seats one by one until nearly half the auditorium stood clapping. The sound filled every corner of the building. Her eyes widened in shock. She had never heard applause like that before. Not for herself. Never. The woman who cried earlier continued clapping while wiping tears from her face. Several audience members looked deeply emotional. Even contestants backstage applauded despite competing against her. One judge quietly shook his head in disbelief before smiling faintly. The applause continued longer than any performance that night. She sat there frozen, unable to fully process what was happening. For years, her music only existed inside empty churches, small apartments, and worn notebooks. Now hundreds of strangers were standing for it. Eventually, she stood from the piano slowly. Her legs felt weak. She bowed awkwardly, still overwhelmed by the reaction around her. Then she quickly walked off stage before emotions completely overtook her. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, her breathing broke apart. Tears instantly filled her eyes while she pressed trembling hands against her face. Not because she was sad, because after years of feeling invisible, people finally heard her. The pastor approached first backstage. He smiled warmly but said nothing for several seconds. Finally, he spoke softly. "I told you truth reaches people." She laughed through tears while trying to calm herself. Nearby contestants looked at her differently now. Not with pity or dismissal anymore. With respect. One student who had once doubted her quietly walked over. "That was beautiful," he admitted honestly. She thanked him softly, still struggling to believe any of this was real. As the competition continued, audience energy felt different afterward. Conversations repeatedly returned to her performance during breaks. Who was she? Where did she learn to play like that? Was that original? People kept asking questions. Even judges spoke quietly among themselves while reviewing notes. Meanwhile, she sat alone backstage holding her notebook tightly against her chest. For once, the notebook didn't feel like a secret anymore. Felt like proof. Proof that all the lonely nights mattered. Proof that pain could become something beautiful. Proof that her mother's belief in her had never been foolish. Hours later, after the final performer finished, contestants gathered on stage while judges prepared results. Bright lights once again filled the auditorium. Her nerves returned slightly while names and awards were announced one by one. Third place, second place. Applause echoed after each result. Then came the final award. The judge stepped toward the microphone holding a small envelope. "This performer reminded us tonight," he said slowly, "that music is not only about skill. It is about emotion, honesty, and connection." The auditorium grew quiet again. "And tonight's first place goes to..." Her hands tightened around each other. Then her name was called. For a moment, she genuinely thought she misheard it. The audience erupted into applause once more while contestants beside her turned in surprise. Someone gently pushed her forward toward the center of the stage. She walked carefully through the lights, still unable to fully believe what was happening. As she accepted the award, flashes from audience phones briefly lit the room. But strangely, the trophy itself didn't matter much to her. The important part had already happened earlier. People listened. People felt something. And for the very first time in her life, she no longer felt invisible at all. The morning after the competition felt strangely normal. Sunlight entered through the apartment window exactly the same way as always. Cars moved outside. Neighbors argued faintly through the walls. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen while she prepared tea before class. For a moment, she almost wondered if the entire competition had been a dream. The trophy sat quietly on the small table near the couch, reflecting sunlight across the room. Only then did reality return. She had actually won. Still, despite everything that happened the night before, life around her didn't suddenly transform overnight. Her apartment remained small. Bills still waited on the counter. She still had classes and work later that day. Part of her liked that, kept everything feeling real. As she prepared to leave for college, her phone suddenly vibrated. Then again, and again. Confused, She pulled it from her pocket and stared at the screen. Messages covered nearly every notification. Classmates, unknown numbers, social media alerts. At first she thought something bad happened, but as she slowly opened the notifications, her confusion deepened. Your performance was amazing. Did someone upload your piano piece online? You're everywhere right now. Her heart began beating faster. Every message mentioned the same thing. A video. Quickly, she opened one of the links sent by a classmate. The screen showed her sitting at the piano during the competition. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire performance and uploaded it online only hours earlier. The video already had thousands of views. She blinked in disbelief. Thousands. The comments moved endlessly beneath the clip. I felt every note. This made me cry. She plays with so much emotion. Who is she? Her hands trembled slightly while scrolling. Most viral videos she had seen online were forgotten within a day or two. She assumed this would be the same. But by the time she reached college later that morning, things already felt different. Students standing near the entrance looked toward her almost immediately. Whispers spread through the hallway. That's her. The piano girl. I watched the video last night. She froze awkwardly near the doorway, suddenly unsure where to look. Only yesterday most people barely noticed her existence. Now strangers recognized her face. A classmate hurried over excitedly while holding up a phone. The video hit 50,000 views overnight, he said. She stared at him in shock. What? And people keep sharing it everywhere. Another student nearby smiled warmly. You deserve it. She thanked them quietly, still overwhelmed by everything happening around her. During music class, even the instructor looked emotional while speaking to her. I always knew you had something special, he admitted. She almost laughed at that. Not because he meant harm, but because for so long, nobody truly saw her until one performance changed everything. After class ended, several students gathered around asking questions about her music. How long have you played? Did you really teach yourself? Was that piece original? Normally, attention made her uncomfortable. Yet something about these conversations felt genuine. People weren't mocking her anymore. They were connecting with her story. Later that evening, curiosity finally pushed her to check the video again. The numbers shocked her even more. Hundreds of thousands of views now. New comments appeared every second. People from different countries shared personal stories beneath the performance. Some wrote about losing loved ones. Others said the music reminded them of difficult times they survived. One comment stayed in her mind longer than the rest. You can hear her life inside the piano. She read that sentence several times quietly, because somehow it was true. That was exactly what she had been trying to express all along. Not perfection. Life. Over the next few days, the video spread even further. Music pages reposted clips from the performance. Reaction channels discussed her emotional playing style. Local news pages shared headlines about the unknown college pianist, surprising judges at the regional showcase. Everywhere she looked, people were talking about the performance. At first, the attention frightened her. She wasn't used to strangers discussing her online. Some comments praised her deeply while others argued over whether the performance was technically perfect. But slowly, she learned to ignore the noise and focus on what truly mattered. People felt something. That alone meant everything to her. One evening, while walking toward the church after work, she noticed something unusual. The pastor stood outside smiling while looking at his phone. You've become famous, he joked gently. She laughed nervously. Not really. He showed her the screen. The performance clip had already crossed several million views. Her eyes widened completely. Millions? She whispered. The pastor nodded proudly. For a few seconds, she couldn't even process the number. Millions of people had heard music created during lonely nights inside this very church. The thought felt unreal. Inside the building, she sat at the same old piano she had practiced on for years. Nothing about it changed. The broken keys still stuck occasionally. The sound still carried slight imperfections. Yet now the room felt different somehow. Not because of fame, but because she finally understood something important. All those lonely years were never meaningless. Every difficult moment became part of the music people connected with now. As she began playing softly again, footsteps echoed nearby. The janitor approached carrying cleaning supplies before stopping beside the piano. "Told you not to hide your gift," he said with a smile. She laughed softly. "I still don't understand why people care so much." The old man leaned against a bench thoughtfully. "Because real things are rare now," he answered. "Most people spend their lives pretending." She looked down quietly. "But your music doesn't pretend." His words stayed with her long after he walked away. Meanwhile, online attention continued growing larger each day. Journalists began requesting interviews. Music schools reached out with scholarship offers. Even professional musicians started sharing her performance publicly. One afternoon, while helping at work, her manager approached holding a newspaper. "You made the front page of the local section," he said proudly. She nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Sure enough, a photo from the competition covered part of the page. The headline read, "Quiet college student captivates millions with emotional piano performance." She stared at the article silently. If her mother were alive, she would have framed that newspaper immediately. The thought brought both warmth and sadness at the same time. That night at home, she pulled out the old notebook again. The same notebook nobody cared about before. Its pages were now worn from years of carrying it everywhere. Pencil marks filled every corner. Some melodies were unfinished while others barely made sense anymore. She flipped through it slowly while sitting near the window. Every page held memories, painful ones, beautiful ones, and suddenly, tears filled her eyes again, not because she felt sad, but because she wished her mother could see all of this. The crowded comments online, the millions of listeners, the standing ovation, the people finding comfort inside her music. Everything started with a promise made years ago on a cold bus ride home. One day somehow we'll find a way, and somehow, they did. A few days later, something even more surprising happened. An email arrived from organizers of a nationally televised music event. They had seen the viral performance and wanted to invite her to perform live during an upcoming special showcase. At first, she honestly thought it might be fake. She reread the message nearly 10 times before finally believing it. A national stage, professional audience, live broadcast. The opportunity felt impossible. Fear returned immediately afterward. What if the first performance was only luck? What if people expected too much now? What if she disappointed everyone? For a moment, old doubts tried returning again. But then she remembered the competition night. The audience silence. The tears. The applause. People didn't connect with her because she was perfect. They connected because she was real. That realization gave her strength. The next evening, she returned once more to the church piano before responding to the invitation. The building sat completely empty except for soft rain tapping against stained glass windows. She opened her notebook carefully and rested her fingers on the keys. Then she played. Not for internet views. Not for judges. Not for fame. Just for the love of music that carried her through years of loneliness and struggle. The melody filled the church slowly and warmly. As she played, memories flowed through her mind again. The broken keyboard. The hospital room. The quiet encouragement from her mother. The first competition. The standing ovation. Everything. When the final note faded away, she sat quietly for a long moment staring at the piano. Then finally, with calm determination, she whispered softly to herself, "This is only the beginning." And deep down, for the very first time in her life, she truly believed it. The weeks leading up to the televised music event passed faster than she expected. Every day felt busy now. Interview requests continued arriving. Music pages online kept sharing clips from her competition performance. Strangers stopped recognizing her in public more often. Some even asked for photos or short videos. At first, all of it felt uncomfortable. She still wasn't used to attention. Part of her remained the same quiet girl who practiced alone inside an empty church while nobody listened. But another part of her slowly began accepting that life had truly changed. Still, despite everything happening around her, she refused to stop living normally. She continued attending classes, continued working shifts, continued walking to the church every evening carrying the same old notebook. Nothing about her love for music changed. If anything, it became even stronger. One cold evening, only a week before the national performance, she sat alone at the church piano practicing quietly while rain tapped softly against the windows. The familiar room still brought her peace. No cameras, no pressure, no expectations, just music. The pastor entered slowly carrying 2 cups of tea before placing one beside the piano. "You've been practicing longer than usual lately," he said with a smile. She laughed softly. "I'm nervous." "You were nervous before the competition too. This feels bigger." The pastor nodded gently. "It is bigger," he admitted. "But don't forget something important." She looked toward him curiously. "The audience changed," he said. "But the reason you play should stay the same." His words settled deeply inside her. Because lately, fear had started returning again. Not fear of performing. Fear of disappointing people. Millions had now seen her online performance. Some called her inspirational. Others described her as the future of piano music. The pressure of those expectations sometimes kept her awake at night. What if this next performance wasn't as emotional? What if people only liked the first one because it was unexpected? What if everything faded away afterward? The internet moved quickly. One moment people celebrated someone, and the next moment they forgot them completely. Those thoughts haunted her more than she wanted to admit. That night after the pastor left, she stayed alone inside the church for hours thinking about everything. Finally, she opened her notebook slowly. Between old pages filled with melodies and unfinished songs, she found the folded note written by her mother years ago. "Never stop playing." Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. She carefully held the paper between her fingers while staring down quietly. Sometimes she still struggled believing how far life had brought her. There were moments when she wished she could sit beside her mother one more time and explain everything. The competition, the standing ovation, the millions of people listening online, the national invitation, all of it. She imagined her mother smiling proudly the way she always did during difficult times. That thought gave her strength again. The night before the televised performance finally arrived. Inside her apartment, nervous energy filled every corner of the room. She barely touched dinner. Sleep felt impossible. Her small table near the window now held things she never imagined owning before. Performance invitations, newspaper articles, scholarship letters, and messages from musicians she admired growing up. Yet beside all those new things sat the same worn notebook from years ago. That notebook mattered more than everything else combined. Before going to bed, she opened it one final time and carefully reviewed the melody she planned to perform on national television. Unlike the competition piece, this new composition felt even more personal. It carried pieces of her entire journey inside it. Loneliness, hope, loss, healing, dreams, everything. The next morning arrived sooner than expected. A car sent by the event organizers picked her up early and drove toward the large theater downtown where the live showcase would take place. As the city passed outside the window, her stomach tightened more with every minute. Huge posters advertising the event covered buildings near the theater entrance. Crowds already gathered outside hours before showtime. The scale of everything felt overwhelming. Inside the building, production crews hurried through hallways carrying cameras, lights, and equipment. Contestants rehearsed backstage while organizers shouted schedules into headsets. The environment felt completely different from the small regional competition. Professional, fast, intense. For a moment, old insecurities returned again. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. Several performers warming up nearby had years of industry experience. Some traveled internationally. Others already had albums and professional managers. Meanwhile, she still practiced on a church piano with broken keys. The difference between them suddenly felt enormous. She quietly moved toward a backstage corner away from everyone else and sat down alone. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she heard a familiar voice. "You're thinking too much again." She looked up in surprise. The janitor from the church stood nearby, smiling warmly beside the pastor. "You came?" she asked softly. "Wouldn't miss this," the old man replied. The pastor gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already belong here," he said firmly. Those simple words calmed her more than they realized. A stage assistant soon approached carrying a clipboard. 10 minutes until your performance." Her heartbeat quickened instantly. The theater audience could already be heard beyond the curtains. Thousands of voices blended together inside the massive room. This was really happening. As performers before her took the stage, she waited backstage trying to steady her breathing. Then finally, her name was announced. Applause echoed through the theater. She closed her notebook carefully and stood up. Bright stage lights appeared beyond the curtain once again. But unlike the first competition, this audience was enormous. Rows upon rows of people stretched across the theater. Cameras pointed toward the stage from every angle while giant screens displayed the performance area overhead. For a split second, fear nearly overwhelmed her. Then she noticed something sitting inside the front pocket of her notebook. The folded note. "Never stop playing." She smiled softly through nervous tears. And suddenly, everything became simple again. She walked toward the piano calmly. Not to impress strangers. Not to chase fame. Not to prove herself. But to tell the truth through music one more time. She sat at the piano bench while the giant theater slowly became silent around her. Even cameras seemed still. For one quiet moment, she looked down at the keys. Then she began playing. The first melody entered the theater softly, almost like a whisper. Yet despite its gentleness, every note carried deep emotion immediately. The audience grew silent almost instantly. Unlike flashy performances filled with speed and dramatic movements, her music unfolded slowly and honestly. It invited people into a story instead of trying to amaze them, and people listened. As the melody continued growing, emotion spread visibly across the audience. Some closed their eyes. Others leaned forward silently. The music felt deeply human. Every difficult year of her life somehow lived inside those notes. The loneliness after losing her mother. The exhausted evenings practicing alone. The fear of failure. The determination to keep going anyway. It was all there, and the audience could feel it. Halfway through the performance, one camera briefly captured tears rolling down a woman's face near the front row. Another showed audience members completely still, absorbed in the music. Meanwhile, backstage performers stopped preparing entirely just to watch her through monitors. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to break the moment. As her hands moved across the keys, something inside her changed too. For years, she searched for validation, for proof she mattered, for someone to finally hear her. But during this performance, she realized she no longer needed permission to believe in herself. The music itself already proved everything. When the final section arrived, the theater became completely silent. The melody softened again, carrying warmth and sadness together in a way words never could. Then came the final note. It echoed gently through the massive theater before fading away completely. Silence followed. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then suddenly, the entire audience rose to their feet. Thunderous applause exploded across the room, louder than anything she had ever heard before. People stood clapping, cheering, wiping tears from their eyes. The standing ovation continued endlessly. She looked out across the crowd in complete disbelief. All those years of invisible struggle, all those lonely nights, every painful moment, somehow led here. Tears filled her eyes as she stood slowly from the piano bench. In that moment, she didn't see fame. She didn't see cameras. She saw proof that pain could become something beautiful when poured into passion instead of bitterness. And somewhere deep inside her heart, she felt close to her mother again. Very close. As applause continued surrounding her, she quietly whispered words nobody else could hear. "We found a way." Then she smiled through tears while the audience continued rising to their feet around her. Because the quiet girl nobody once noticed had finally become impossible to ignore. And it all started with simple notes played from the heart.